everyone, welcome to another episode of ACG Projects. My name is Gwen, and today we're going to be building your resume entirely hosted on Azure. Yes, that's right. Not only are you going to have a shiny new digital resume that you can share via your own custom domain, you're also going to have a project that you can add to your GitHub and something that you can talk about. This whole thing is going to run you for about $5 and you're going to get hands-on with a bunch of different Azure services. Let's get started by first taking a look at the diagram of what we're building. Fantastic. So this is what we're going to be building. The meat and potatoes of our solution is going to live inside of this Blob Storage, which will hold our static website, our resume. And in that website, we're going to be using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The JavaScript is going to be used to implement a visitor counter. And not only will it be used to display that information, but also to call an API, which we're going to implement with an Azure function. This Azure function is going to interact with Azure CosmosDB, which is the database service we'll be using to store our visitor counter info. We're going to be using Azure CDN to enable features like HTTPS and custom domain support for our static site that is deployed on Azure Blob Storage. And finally, for all our CI/CD tooling, we're going to be using GitHub. Let me now show you an example of what will end up once we finish this project. Alrighty, at the top you can see my visitor counter right here, and then some social links. Right now it's at 2,259. If I refresh the page, you see it goes up to 2,260. So it's working. Then I have a bio section, certifications, work experience. Yeah, it is a pretty simple site, but it's got all the info that we need to display for a resume. And you can, of course, add more if you like. The goal of this project isn't to sharpen your web development skills. It's all about Azure today. All right, one more thing before we dive in to get hands-on. Let's talk about prerequisites. First off, you'll need an Azure account, which we're going to be using to deploy our website and our Azure functions. Second, you're going to need the .NET Core 3.1 SDK. I know .NET 5 is out, but we're going to be using 3.1 at the moment just because it's a little better supported for Azure Functions development at the moment. Next, you're going to need Azure Functions core tools, which will allow us to develop Azure Functions locally on our own machines. And you're going to need some kind of text editor. Ideally, you'd be using Visual Studio Code because it provides some extensions like the C# extension and the Azure Functions extension. That just makes developing Azure Functions a lot easier locally. Then you're going to need the Azure CLI, which is a set of commands that we're going to be using to create and manage Azure resources. And finally, like I mentioned, you're going to need the C# extension, because that's a programming language we're going to be using to develop our Azure function. All of these resources and links can be found in the resources page. So you can click on those and set yourself up for success, and then we can dive in. First up, let's build out the front end. This is going to include creating our own GitHub repo and cloning it locally, cloning the starter code and adding it to our project, updating the HTML with our resume info, creating the JavaScript code for the visitor counter, and pushing all of our code right back up to GitHub. You can see in the slide here, I've highlighted the section that we're going to be focusing on in terms of the diagram for this section 1 building the front end. All right, so let's get to it. Alrighty, you're going to make sure that you have a GitHub account set up and that you're logged into that account. You're going to head into github.com/new. And this is going to take us to the create a new repository screen. We're not going to be using a repository template. Make sure the owner is set to the account you want to use. And for the name, we can use Azure Resume. For this description, I'm going to put in my own Azure Resume following ACG Project video. Should be good enough. I'm going to set it to public, and then I'm going to add a README. That way I can clone the code immediately. And then I'm going to hit create repository. Should take a few moments, and then you should see a page that is your username / Azure resume, which is the name that we just provided. And we are now ready to clone this code locally. Alrighty, now let's clone our repository locally. So you should see this green button that says code. You're going to click on that and make sure you're not in HTTPS, but in SSH. SSH is more of a secure way of cloning our code because it uses a password protected SSH key. You do have to make sure that is set up beforehand, but that is outside of the scope of this video. So just make sure to have that set up first. Now we're going to copy this and then head into my terminal. I'm going to move into the desktop and I'm going to do git clone and simply paste in that value that we got from GitHub. Awesome. So now I can move into that folder and you see we have our repository there. Nothing is in here besides our README because you can see we only have one file in here. Now let's move on to cloning the starter code. Alrighty, I've provided some getting started resources that just makes working on this project a little bit easier. So if you head into github.com /acloudguru-resources /ACG Project Azure resume starter, I'll make sure to have that link in the resources docs. You're going to find the code that you need here. And we're going to follow that same process that you followed to clone your repository locally. We'll do the same for this. So on code, again, you're going to copy that address provided in the clone section. And then you're going to head into your terminal. And I'm going to make sure I'm in the desktop. Make sure you're not in your repository. Make sure you're in your desktop right here. And then again, just do git clone. And go ahead and paste in that value. Alrighty, so my desktop, at the moment I have those two folders, right? Let's do it this way. I have the My Azure Resume and then the ACG Project Azure Resume Starter. So if I move into the ACG Project one, you'll see we have the README, the backend folder, the frontend folder, and the tests. Alright, let's go now into copying the elements of the starter code into our own repository. Alrighty, what you're going to do now is from your ACG Project Azure Resume Starter, you're going to grab the backend folder and the frontend folder and copy those two folders into your own repository folder. Right, so let's head back here. So the structure should be your Azure Resume should now have the backend folder and then the front-end folder, and don't remove anything from the starter code. You also have this tests folder. We're going to use that when we implement testing in a later on section, but you don't actually have to copy that folder into your actual project. So for right now, just make sure you have the backend and the front-end. Alrighty, let's talk a little bit about the structure of this project. Alrighty, in the terminal, now I'm going to move into my own repo, Azure Resume. And then we're going to open this up in Visual Studio Code, which is the text editor I will be using for this demo. And we're going to just move this up here, right here. Full screen this, close this out. Alrighty. Now, let's talk a little bit about the structure of the project. So you see we have a backend and a front end and a README. Let's expand the front end and you see we have a CSS folder, an images folder, a JavaScript folder, and then we have the index.html. And we do have a README for this section as well. So the reason I put a README inside of not only the main repository, but also in the front end folder and then in the back end folder is so if there's anything specific that you want to provide in your README that would be a better fit to have at that level, then you can go ahead and add there. So you could keep your repository README for general resources, and then maybe go into more detail in the individual ones. That's up to you, but I just put them in there. All right. So our website's going to live in the frontend folder, and then in the backend folder, our Azure Functions is going to live inside of the API folder. And then once we implement tests for our code, those are going to live inside of the tests folder. And alrighty, now that we understand the structure, we can go ahead and do some actual editing of the code. Okay, now that we have our project on our machine and we understand the structure, we can go ahead and edit the HTML with our own resume details and write the JavaScript code for the visitor counter functionality. So now you're going to want to dive into the index.html. Remember, that's in the frontend folder, and then change the content to match the actual details of your resume. So since this is a template and I wanted to provide something that could get you going without you having to write HTML from scratch, I just provided details that match my resume. So you see the title says Gwyn resume. You're going to want to change that. You're going to want to dive into this headline here. It says, "Hi, I'm Gwyn, and this page has been viewed." Here is an element we're going to be using for the counter. You could keep this if you'd like. You can change the wording. Just make sure to keep this element here, right here, that has counter in here, because we're going to use that to display our counter info. Now, you're going to want to change your social media links. You may have more, you may have less. So update those, or else your resume is going to be pointing to my social media. Then when you dive into the About section, you're going to want to update it with your bio and any information you want to provide in that section. Then moving on to the resume section, you're going to want to update your certifications or any other educational details you want to add there. The following is the work experience, and then again, you're going to want to make sure that matches your current work experience and your past work experience, right? Just like a resume. And following that, work experience, and at the bottom we have some social media links again. There is a copyright in there. Since this is a template, we do have to give proper credit. So I've left that in there. Make sure to not remove that. This is a free to use as long as you are providing this correct link in the copyright section. So that's in there. Just please don't remove that. And let's take a look at what it actually looks like in a browser. Yeah, so this is my file open. If you go into the folder and then you click on index.html, it'll open up in a browser. And you'll see this is that headline, which I mentioned to change. This is the counter element is actually in here, but since there's no number, no data there, you're not going to see it. And this is that text that's surrounding that. So let's go back up there. Where is it? Oh, right here. So here. Right. So you could change this text before this and after to say anything you'd like, but I think it kind of makes sense where it's at now. And since there aren't any details in here that are specific to me, I think you could keep it. But again, that is up to you. Then the social links that you can change, the About Me section that you can change, certifications, work, you can add more details in here if you'd like, and then more links at the bottom. And again, the attribution link is here. Please do not remove that. One thing I forgot is this little picture of me. Yes, so if we go to the About Me section, right in here, you see I have an image element that is called me.png. So if we expand the images folder, you see in here, there's a picture of me. And you can remove this and then add a PNG of yourself, picture of yourself. If you name it me.png, that means that in the index, you don't have to make any changes. But again, you can make it to anything you like. All right. So yeah, go in here, change up the details to match what your resume looks like. And then we can move on to the next section where we're going to be writing some JavaScript code. Alrighty, now we're going to create the JavaScript code that is going to show the counter data in this element right here that has the ID set to counter. So what you're going to do is in the front end folder, click new file, and we're going to call it main.js. First thing we need is to declare a constant that we're going to call it function API. And we don't have the URL to the API at the moment, so we're going to leave this blank. We'll have that later on when we actually implement the API via an Azure function. But right now we're just going to write the JavaScript code that will actually grab the JSON that is provided from that API, grab the correct part of that JSON, and show it in our JavaScript. In our HTML. Okay, so let's now create the actual function that's going to do that work. So we're going to call this get visit count. Yes, that should work. And let's create that arrow function. Fantastic. So now let's declare a variable to actually hold the count data. We'll just set it to some random number to get started. We'll just say 30. Fetch function API. So now we're saying, all right, go and fetch the data from that URL that we're providing in function API, but nothing's there at the moment. Keep that in mind, right? Then once you do that, grab the response, and oops. Oh my goodness, here we go. There we go. And then we're going to return the response, the JSON. Alrighty. Then we're going to grab that response and we'll log a quick message to the console just for debugging purposes. A website called Function API. Fantastic. Now we're going to set that variable that we created up here to the actual data that's in the JSON response. It should be called count. Yes. Now we're going to grab our HTML document. So document get element by ID. And then we're going to grab the element that has the ID counter. And then the inner text, we're going to set that to the count data. All right, so see, this is really the meat and potatoes. Besides the actual call here, so the API call, the fetch call, which means go fetch, go get the data that we need from this URL. We're grabbing this count here, and we're saying, all right, it's this variable, it's set to 30 now, but assign it to whatever that JSON response gave you. And then go into the document, find the element that has counter as its ID, grab the inner text, and then set it to count. Right. So if our counter is at 55, it's going to set this element to 55. So this element is going to get updated. This text that is in here will display that counter data. This is the inner text. Okay. And finally, if there is some kind of error, we're just going to grab the error and whoops, not console.error, just error. We don't need that either. And we're just going to log it to the console, the error message. Oh, why does it keep? All right, error. There we go. That's that. And we're probably missing there and there. Yeah, and finally return count. Yes. Okay. Oh, one thing I forgot here at the top. So how does this function actually get called? Like when does this get visit count actually get called? Okay. So what we got to do is window dot add event listener, and then we're going to call DOM content loaded, and then we're going to say event get visit count. Fantastic. There we go. Okay, so basically what we're saying, all right, when the content is loaded, go and run this event, which is get visit count, which is what we've just written down here. And that's pretty much it for this JavaScript part. Now, we can't test this like I mentioned because we haven't implemented the function. But once we get it running locally, we're going to come in here and update the code so it actually works locally. That'll be in a following section. Alrighty, now let's take a look at how we can send all these changes back up to our GitHub repo because we've added files, we've edited files, and we want to make sure our version control is up to date. Alrighty, so our front end is pretty much done. Now let's take a look at how we can push all of our code back up to GitHub. In VS Code, you can go to terminal, new terminal, and it's going to start a terminal inside of your current project. So instead of Azure Resume, what I'm going to do now is type in git add dash uppercase A. This is telling Git to add all of the changes that we've made. Then we're going to do a commit, which is committing all of these changes and getting them ready to actually get pushed right back up to our GitHub repository. We are going to provide a message, so the -m allows us to provide a message. And we'll say updates to structure and created main.js file. A simple message of summarizing what you've made in these changes. It's good practice. Now it's going to actually give you a list of the things that have been added or removed and such. So now we can do git push. Fantastic. One thing I did want to mention is if we go to your README here, the top level README, it's good practice to document your code and you can use your README to do that. So for example, I've added here another title. It's for steps. If you click on this button up here, it'll open preview and it'll actually show you what your README will look like. Your READMEs are written with something called Markdown language. Outside of the scope of this project, but you can go ahead and do a search on that, and there's plenty of good resources and tutorials out there. First steps, frontend folder contains the website. We could add another thing like main.js contains visitor counter code, things like that. Any resources that you've used, like you could create this into a link here and then just link to the video that you watched. I don't know what the video actually is, the link is, but anyway, you would provide that in here. And you see it turns into a link. You would provide that in here. You can add like code snippets, for example. And then in between here, the JS stands for JavaScript. You can provide some code that you wanted to show. You can provide screenshots, GIFs, all that kind of thing. Yeah. So it's good practice to implement documentation, and it's better to do it as you go because it's easier because you're actually doing it and you remember it easier. If you leave it for the end, you might not remember things that you struggled with or things that you wanted to make note of. So it's good practice to implement it in here. Alrighty. So and now I'm going to just add these changes too. Again, git commit updates to readme, and then we'll do a push. Fantastic. Now if we head into, where is it here? My resume, I refresh that, you'll see I'll have my front end, my back end, and then my readme does actually contain, we'll refresh it once more. Here we go. Folder. Front end folder contains the website. Oh, you know what might have happened here? Let's move into, yes, you see this little dot here means the changes haven't been saved. So if I hit Command S, it'll go ahead and save. But also if you go to File, make sure you click on Autosave. That way it'll implement autosaving here. So now again, we have to do that same git add, git commit, updates to readme, And then we'll do another push there. And now if we refresh here, we'll see more info in the README. Alrighty, cool. Our front end pretty much has been built. We wrote some JavaScript. We edited the HTML to match our resume details. We created our GitHub repo. And now we're pretty much ready to start implementing our API and our backend. It's time to build the backend. This part will consist of creating an Azure CosmosDB account, database, container, and adding the counter data to that container. Next, we'll create an Azure function with visual code locally with the Azure Functions extension, set up CosmosDB bindings to retrieve and update the counter data, and finally, we'll run things locally to make sure our website can view the counter data. If we take a look at the slides here, you'll see I've highlighted the section of the diagram that we're going to be focusing on, and that's the function and the CosmosDB resources. All right, let's get to it and start off by creating the CosmosDB resources. Alrighty, let's get started by creating our Azure CosmosDB account. I'm going to search for Cosmos and select it. I'm going to click on Create Azure CosmosDB account. Make sure you're in the subscription that you want to create your resources in. I'm going to create a new resource group called Azure Resume-Resource Group. And then everything that I deploy is going to live inside of that resource group. So just make a note of that name. I'm going to call the account name just Azure Resume. Perfect. So for the API, we do have a couple of options, but we're going to stick to Core SQL. There are other options: MongoDB API, Cassandra, Azure Table, Gremlin. We're going to stick to SQL. Select the region that works best for you. For me, it's East US2. Capacity mode, we're going to set it to serverless. Now, serverless does offer quite affordable pricing, and since we are working with something that doesn't necessarily need to be on all the time, it's, our use case here is pretty simple. Serverless is the capacity mode that's going to work best for us in terms of like the actual power of the account and the pricing, right? And then we can go ahead and click on review and create, and then hit create. This should take a few minutes. So let's go ahead and just let it create. Alrighty, it looks like our account has finished creating. We're going to click on go to resource and continue with creating our CosmosDB database. So what I'm going to do is actually click on the left side on Data Explorer and then click on New Database. And we're going to call this Azure Resume and click on OK. This is going to create that database for us. And inside of that, we can create the container and the items. Alrighty, so you should see under data on the left side, Azure Resume, and there's these three dots that you can click on. Click on that and hit new container. Database ID, make sure you're selecting that database that we just created, Azure Resume. And for the container ID, I'm going to call it counter. And for the partition key, I'm just going to keep it as ID. A partition key is like a field that you're going to use to distinguish the different items inside of the container. I'm going to set it to ID for now. And then we can go ahead and click on OK. So we've got our database, we've got our container, and now we've got to go ahead and add an item to the container. So we can expand Azure Resume and expand counter container, and then click on items. And since this is SQL, you'll see that this is just selecting everything from this container, but there's nothing in here. So we can click on new item up here and replace with new document ID up here. We're just going to set it to 1. And we need to add one more field, which is the actual counter data. We'll just set that to count, and we'll set it to 0 at the moment because there's nothing. No one has visited our site yet, right? So the item inside of our counter, we only have one. If for some reason you needed to have counters for other sites, you could have an ID 2, ID 3, and then make sure you're grabbing the correct item by referencing the right ID. But we're just going to have this one here, and the count is set to 2, 0, again, because we've had no visitors. Now you can hit save, and it's going to add a bunch of metadata in there. It's not really important to know what it does at the moment, but that's pretty much it. That's what we've done now for setting up our CosmosDB resources. And now we have everything we need to go ahead and create our Azure Functions. So let's go ahead and do that. Azure Functions is a serverless solution that allows us to create pieces of code that are event-driven, and we don't have to worry about the infrastructure behind those pieces of code. Now, Functions also has this thing called bindings that allow us to connect other resources to our function. So let's dive into creating a function, connecting Azure Cosmos DB bindings to the function, and viewing our counter data via the function. Alrighty, let's now create our Azure function inside of Visual Studio Code. So back in Visual Code, I'm actually going to close all these files that I don't need open. And on the left side in your Azure Functions extension, under the Functions section, click on this little folder that says Create New Project. And you're going to select Browse. Make sure in the backend folder you select API. And then hit Select there. We're going to use C# for the language, .NET Core 3. And we're going to be using HTTP trigger as the template. And we're going to call it Get Resume Counter. That default namespace is fine. We're going to set the access rights to function, and we're going to let it create. If you get this message, there are unresolved dependencies, go ahead and click on Restore. Let's give it a second to restore and finish creating for us. Alrighty, what we're going to do is open up the getResumeCounter.cs, and in the terminal, we're going to move into the correct folder, backend, see the API, and then in here we're going to do func host start. We're actually going to run the Azure function. Even though this is a simple HTTP trigger function, it actually fully works. So let's run func host start. Remember, you do have to run this command from where your function lives, so that's inside of the API folder. All right, so you see we get a list of functions, and we have the getResumeCounter function that we created, and we have a URL that we can click on and go to. There we go. We see this expected output, this HTTP triggered function executed successfully. Pass a name in the query string or in the request body for a personalized response. So I can say name equals Gwyn, and we'll see that the personalized response is hello Gwyn, this HTTP triggered function executed successfully. All right. So we can do Control-C to stop this. Yeah, simple, but it works. Now let's take a look at how we can add CosmosDB functionality to this, so we can get our counter data. Alrighty, in the resources page, you're going to find an article that says Azure Cosmos DB Trigger and Bindings for Azure Functions 2 and Higher Overview. And this is some good documentation to read and just get familiar with how this binding works with Azure Functions. But first off, we're going to scroll towards the bottom to the Add to Your Functions app section. And since we're using C#, we can add it by installing the NuGet package. So let's open that up. And in NuGet, we're going to use the .NET CLI. We're going to copy this, and then we're going to head over to our Visual Studio and make sure we're inside of where the function lives, which is the API folder, and simply paste in that command. And that is going to go ahead and add the package that we'll need to work with Cosmos DB. Fantastic. One more thing we're going to need is, I had this file already open, but it's the local.settings.json file. This is where we can save like secrets and keys that we need to work. And this file only remains on locally. So when you push this to GitHub, the git ignore will make sure to ignore this file. So this won't get pushed. So here we're going to add key value pair. We're going to call it Azure Resume Connection String. And then we need to provide a value in here. So let's head over to our Azure Resume Cosmos DB account, and we'll scroll down on the left side to keys. And then we're going to copy the primary connection string. Fantastic. And then we'll paste that value in here. There we go. We'll save that, and that's all we need to do now. Okay, so we have everything we need to actually start adding the bindings into the code already. So first thing we actually need to add is a C# class so we can describe the counter object. So what we're going to do is in that backend folder, right click, new file, and we're going to call this counter. Make sure it's a capital C, .cs. And in here, we're going to be using newtonsoft.json. And then make sure the namespace is the same of the function, which is company.function. And then we can go ahead and do public class. Whoops, too many new lines there, counter. And now we can go ahead and describe the counter. It has a public string ID, and we'll have our getters and our setters. Oops, get set. And then it also has a public int, which is the actual value of the counter, and it's called count get set. We'll also add in some JSON properties here, and the property name is going to equal ID, and then we'll add one for the int. There we go. JSON property name is going to equal count. And this is just to make sure it matches the property names that we created in our container in our Azure CosmosDB account. So I'll actually show you this. So let's head over to here. Go back to our Data Explorer. This is our CosmosDB account. Counter, expand it. Right, so we have this item. The ID is 1, and then the count is 0. And we just want to make sure those are matching these properties here, which they do. All right, so now we can go ahead and close this. And now we do have everything we need to add the CosmosDB bindings. So let's actually close some of these things. We'll do Command J and Command B just to have a little bit more space there. Okay, so let's get a new line in here and go ahead and add the CosmosDB binding. So let's start with the first one here. We do need to provide some info here. So database name, we called it Azure Resume. Then we also need to provide the collection name, which is the same as the container name. I'm not sure why they didn't put container, but anyway, we called it counter, right? And we also need to provide the connection string, which is connection string setting equals Azure Resume connection string. This is that string that we added to our local.settings.json, righty? And then now we need to provide, the ID of the item that we want to retrieve. And that would be ID equals, it's 1 for this one. And then we need to provide where we're actually going to store that. So it's counter, and we're just going to call it counter. And we have to add a comma there because we have this logger object down here. Alrighty. So this first binding is going to allow us to retrieve an item. And it's going to allow us to retrieve an item that has the ID 1. It's going to connect to the database using the Azure Resume connection string. It's going to look for that item inside of the collection or container named counter inside of the database Azure Resume. Okay, cool. So now let's add one more binding in here, which we'll have to use for the output binding. Because when you think about it, we're first retrieving our item, then we're going to add 1 because we're going to increase an additional visit. So say our counter is 5, we're going to get 5. So that's the value that's going to get in here. We're going to update it 1, and then we're going to go and return to the database the number 6 because it's been increased, but we'll need some object that we can output. So that's what we're going to use the output binding for. It's actually pretty similar. Hold on. So we can pretty much just copy and edit. So we'll go ahead and paste that in. Same connection, same, except we're going to call it this out. And then we're going to call this updated counter. Fabulous. We had too many lines in here. There we go. Oh, it's giving me an error. What error? Ah, here we go. We'll have to remove the async to be able to make it work this way. Fantastic. All right, we're getting a bunch of errors now. Since this code is from the HTTP template, there are some things that we'll have to remove. So for example, we can still have this log, but we won't need any of this stuff here, really. We're still going to need a return, but we're going to make some more changes in here as well. Instead of it being a task action result, it's actually going to be an HTTP response message. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have to add a package for this here. Yeah, we're going to need to add using system.net.http. That should clear our error down here. Alrighty. Fantastic. Now we are ready to add the code to retrieve the counter, update the counter, and return it as JSON. So let's move into that. Alrighty, let's dive into some code. One thing I did notice that I forgot to add here is our partition key. So each one of these bindings needs a partition key, and it's set to 1. Remember, we set our partition key to the ID field. So that's why we have to add that in here too, because our collection is partitioned, though since it's so simple, it might not have to be, but anyway, we did that. So yeah, partition key 1, make sure that's set on both of these bindings. Alrighty, so we can keep this log message in here, but first thing we're going to do is set that updated counter object to basically be the same as the incoming counter object. So our input binding will grab and populate this object when the function is executed, but this one doesn't get populated because it's an output one. So what we're doing is we're just setting the updated counter to be the same as the counter object, right? And then on the updated counter, since this is the one we're going to be returning to the database to update the count information, we're going to have to increase the count by 1. There we go. And now let's structure the JSON that we want to return. So we can just say JSON to return. And this is what we're going to see in the browser, what's going to be available via the API, JSON convert. And we're going to serialize the counter object. And remember here, we're serializing the current counter and not the updated one. Okay. And then finally, we can get rid of this here, return, and because we're going to write another one. So return new HTTP response message and HTTP status code.ok. Fantastic. And here we're just going to create the content of this message. It's going to equal new string content. And in here, we're going to provide the JSON to return. And we need to tell it the encoding. We're probably missing a package, which is why it's not auto-populating here. I'm pretty sure this is a capital E, but we'll take a look at that in a second. And then we just want to make sure that we tell it it's actually JSON format. And we can end this here. Yes, so we should be able to. Yeah, so the package we were missing is using system.text. Fantastic. And yeah, I think that's good to go, right? So if we go into our terminal and then we'll just do a func host start, make sure you're inside of the API folder. This should run our function and provide us a URL. Yes, we're going to copy this and then open it up in here. And we'll see our count is set to 4. 5, 6, and every time we could run the function again, it increments. If we actually go to our, let's close this, CosmosDB account, go to the Data Explorer. I could have just refreshed it, but anyway, go into here. We should see that this also matches. Our count is 7, and this matches 7. Fantastic. Oh, it was at 4, I think, the first time I executed it, just because I was testing something out. It should be, for you, set to 0. Also, if you came in here and you say wanted to edit this, like you set this back to 0, then you update, and then you ran this, you see it'd be 1, 2, and so forth, right? Alrighty, so we've got the code to work with the CosmosDB bindings. Fantastic. Alrighty, now that we have the function running locally and we can view the counter data in the browser, let's work on hooking up the front end with the backend. We're going to head into the main.js and update the API URL with the function's local URL. Then we'll run the function locally and open up the index.html to make sure we can actually view the counter data. All right, let's get started. Alrighty, before we get everything working locally, what we have to do is on the Azure Functions, enable course to work with the local Azure Functions host. We can do that by adding an entry here in our local.settings.json. It's going to be called host, and we need to provide in here just something that's called course, and we'll just set it to everything at the moment. Yeah, that should work for us. Oops. There we go. Fantastic. So add this entry into your local.settings.json. And now we can do func host start. Remember, make sure you're inside of your API because that's where your function lives. Fantastic. So what we're going to do is grab this URL here and then go into our, well, first let's just open it up in the browser, make sure it's working. Yep, we're getting a count of 7. Fantastic. Now that same URL, we're going to open up from our front end, main.js, and instead of this being an empty URL, we're going to provide that value in there, and that's it. Let's open up this index.html. We're going to open up in the browser, and actually, hold on. Let's just open it up over here. Whoops, over here. Here we go. Okay, and we see 9. That should match. If we go into our CosmosDB Data Explorer, close this, get it to refresh. 9, it matches. If I refresh this here, 10, 11, oh, and there we go. Technically, we have everything working locally. Okay, now we've got our front end and back end connected and everything works locally. Let's work on deploying it all. And I'm pretty sure you're eager to see your website in action and actually visit it via a domain instead of just running it locally. And that's what we're going to work on right now. We'll deploy the Azure function. We'll get the function URL. We'll update the JavaScript code with the function URL. Then we'll deploy the website to Blob Storage. Then we're going to set up Azure CDN and HTTPS support and set up our custom domain. And finally, we'll visit our site via our domain and make sure the counter is working. And of course, we'll make a couple of commits to our GitHub just to make sure we're up to date with our version control. All right, as you can see in the diagram of the solution, this is what we're focusing on right now. It's just getting everything deployed and Azure CDN set up with our static site. Let's start with deploying the Azure function. Alrighty, first thing we're going to do is just go back to the very top of our repo, and then we're just going to add all the changes that we've done because we've done a bunch. And we'll type a message in here, created Azure Function API, and we'll do a git push there to get all of our code up to date. Fantastic. All right, so now let's deploy our Azure Function. Let's head on over to the Azure Function extension and then just highlight our project that we're working on locally. And we're going to click on this blue arrow, which is going to allow us to deploy to Function app. You're going to select the subscription you want to use. And we're going to use the advanced one. And we're going to name it Get Resume Counter. Alrighty. For the runtime stack, we're going to use .NET Core 3.1. Linux as the OS, the consumption plan. And make sure you select the resource group that you created when you used your when you created your CosmosDB account. It's going to be Azure Resume for me. And we can create a new storage account here. We're going to call it actually Azure Resume Storage. Fantastic. We'll create an application insights resource for now, and we'll call it Azure Resume App Insights. And I'm going to use the region that's closest to me, East2S2. Fantastic. Let's give this a moment to deploy. Alrighty, it looks like it's finished deploying. So what we're going to do is go into our local.settings, and remember that this local.settings.json file does not get uploaded to production or to Azure because this is meant to stay safe, right? So we're going to copy this value, and we're going to name it the same thing inside of the function secrets in the portal. So head on over to your Azure portal. We'll do portal.azure.com, and then we're going to find that function that we just deployed. Alrighty, let's type in function app here, and we see our get resume counter here. Left side, we're going to go to configuration, and then we're going to add a new application setting. We're going to need to make sure, oh, we copied the wrong value. Value goes here, and it's Azure Resume Connection String. So essentially, this is your local.settings.json, but inside of the actual production environment. Ideally, you wouldn't paste in the actual value here. Like you could use something like Azure Key Vault, but that is outside of the scope of this video. But might be a nice next step for you to improve this project. Alrighty, we're going to hit save, then we're going to hit continue. Okay, so now we have to grab the function URL, and we'll go into functions, get resume counter, that get function URL, this right here, because this is what we're going to use to update our JavaScript code. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code, and we'll go into that main.js. So what we can actually do is create a function API URL, and then we'll copy this one in. This is the production URL technically, and then we can call this local function API, function API, right? And then in this code, we just want to use update the right function API URL. Here we go. There we go. Function API URL. Fantastic. All right. Okay, we've updated our JavaScript in our site. We need to enable course. Remember we used the local.settings here to just say allow course. Well, now we need to enable that same setting. But remember, since this doesn't get pushed to production, we have to actually do it inside the Azure portal. So let's go back to get resume counter. We can actually search for it because I'm not 100% sure where it is. It's a setting on its own. So we're going to enable that. Fantastic. Oh yeah, so to allow the use of the wildcard, which is what we were using in the local.settings.json, we'll just remove everything that's in this list. Once we have our domain and we know where our Blob Storage hosted static website is going to be executing from, we can add that in here. But for now, this is fine. Alrighty, fantastic. It looks like we can now, you know what might be a cool thing is if we grab the function URL again and just visit it in the browser. So we'll copy this and then go paste and go. And we still get the same data, right? Except this isn't locally. This is your actual Azure function deployed. This is an actual API. Very simple, but it works. So congrats, your first function has been deployed. Now let's work on deploying the website. So Azure has a few services that we could use to deploy our web app, but today we're going to be using the static site feature that comes with Azure Blob Storage. Now, there's things like Azure Static Web Apps that would abstract a bunch of things that we actually have to do manually when we're using the static site feature with Blob Storage. For example, HTTPS support and a custom domain support. But the goal for this project is for you to understand how these services work individually. That way, when you go use a service that abstracts them, you understand what's going on. Also, Blob Storage hosting is extremely affordable, and that's pretty ideal when you have a static site, like in our case, our resume. Alrighty, enough chit chat, let's get to it. Alrighty, so you are going to need the Azure Storage extension. So if you search for that in the extension list, it's the one by Microsoft. Make sure that's installed. Alrighty, let's head back to the front end folder, right click on it, and then we're going to hit deploy to static website via Azure Storage. We're going to select our subscription, and then I'm going to select this create new storage account advanced. I'm going to name this Azure Resume ACG. And it does need to be globally unique. So if it doesn't allow you to hit enter and it's in red, it's because the name has already been used. And I'm going to put it inside of the Azure Resume-RG. And we're going to hit yes. And our index document is index.html, so we can enter. And enter for the error page. And we're going to select the region best for us. For me, it's East US 2. Let's give that a minute to deploy. Alrighty, it looks like that finished. If we click browse to website, let's see what pops up. It opened up on another window. Let me bring it up here. Fantastic. Now, what I notice is that the counter isn't loading the counter data. So let's take a look at what's going on. Most browsers have web developer tools. So if we go into web developer tools, we should be able to see what's going on. It looks like course isn't working. So what we're going to do is go into the function, back over here, function, and look for course, and right down here. And then we're going to paste in the website, our website URL. There we go. Then hit save. All right, that might take a moment to update, but let's try refreshing it there. There we go. It just took a minute to reload for us, and the counter is working there. If we scroll, we'll see our website has been deployed, and it's at this URL, which isn't very memorable. Alrighty, now we can go ahead and configure our custom domain and SSL certificates. We're going to be using Azure Content Delivery Network, Azure CDN, for a couple of things for our project. First, it's going to cache the content of our website, and this is going to enable low latencies to our site from anywhere in the world. Also, it can provision TLS SSL certificates for our site, which would enable HTTPS support. And it's also going to allow us to map a custom domain for our site. Now, for this section of the project, you are going to need a domain from any DNS provider, so make sure to have that handy. Let's get to it. Alrighty, let's enable Azure CDN. Let's head into storage account and select the correct one. For me, it's Azure Resume ACG. On the left side, we're going to scroll to Blob Service, under here, Azure CDN, and then we're going to create a new profile. I'm going to call this Azure Resume ACG, and well, it looks like it was taken to a cloud guru. And pricing tier, I'll set this to standard Microsoft, and then CDN endpoint name. I'll set it to the same as the CDN profile, and then make sure here I select a static website and not blob. Then I'll hit create and give this a few minutes to create itself. Alrighty, let's now click on that endpoint that was just created, and we can click on endpoint hostname. And you'll see now that this .azureedge.net brings us to our website. Now, what I will say is we do have to, like, the visitor counter won't work here because remember we enabled course for the previous URL, the ones that it's assigned by Blob Storage. But since we're going to be hooking up a custom domain anyway, I'm not going to bother doing that at this point. Also, if you got an error page that says, hey, nothing can be found, wait about 10 minutes or so. Sometimes the CDN profile takes that long to provision and to get access to your actual static website. So wait about 10 minutes and then refresh. Don't worry if that message appears. All right, now let's take a look at how we can map the domain. Before we move on to mapping our custom domain to our website, I did want to briefly touch on this concept of caching and purging, since we're working with Azure CDN, which is a content delivery network. Now, caching is the process of storing copies of files in a cache so that they can be accessed more quickly. And this is where Azure CDN comes in, delivers low latencies, so it's quicker to access your site from anywhere in the world. Now, purging is the process of removing that content that's been cached and then updating it. And this is before some date that you've set. Typically, most CDN services will purge or update your cache depending on like a cycle or a date that you set. But we can manually execute a purge to refresh that content on our own. Now, we're actually going to include a purge step as part of our CI/CD. In our pipeline, and that's going to be in the next section. But just wanted to clue you in on this concept at the moment, just for a little bit more of context. All right, now let's dive into mapping the domain. Alrighty, so depending on which DNS service you're using, this might look a little different, but I'm going to show you what I use. I use Namecheap, and then type cname record, host www, and then the value for my CDN profile, so that .azureedge.net value. Then you're going to head back into your CDN profile. That's where you have your endpoint hostname, origin hostname. And then under custom domains, this is in the overview section, you're going to hit custom domain. And then you're going to type in that domain. For me, it's gwynethpeña.me. And then you're going to hit add and give that a moment. Alrighty, and that finished. It says here successfully created a CDN custom domain. It can take up to 10 minutes, so let's give it about 10 minutes. Alrighty, so it's been about 10 minutes or so. And you see if I go to the page, it says the account being accessed does not support HTTP. That's correct. So if we put HTTPS at the beginning, and obviously the certificate is not valid here, but you can see our domain is working. So there's two things we actually have to do now. We have to enable HTTPS, and we also have to update the functions course settings to now use this URL. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to head back to the CDN endpoint settings. We're going to click on the domain, and then we're going to enable custom domain HTTPS, and we're going to leave the default settings. We're going to hit save there. This allows us to enable HTTPS for the domain. Alrighty, so now it actually takes 4 steps. So submit the request domain validation certificate, provisioning, and complete. So this, you'll have to actually wait after each step goes through. Alrighty, it looks like all the other steps are done. We should be able to just close this out. And we now see the host name and HTTPS has been enabled. Details certificate successfully deployed. So if we now visit www.gwynethpeña.me. Oh, yes, we have to go to HTTPS. Solid. And it is now working. Last step is to go ahead and add this domain to the course settings on the function. So let's go here and let's go to the function app. It's in our recents, and we'll search for course. Nope, maybe we'll scroll. Here we go. And we'll also add in There we go. Then we'll hit save. Alrighty, and this might take a few minutes. Let's give it a few minutes. Ah, it worked right there. Fantastic. All right, so technically now you do have a fully functioning website, but what if you wanted to make a change to the front end or to the back end? Think about it, you would have to dive into the HTML, make whatever update you wanted to, then purge the content, upload it to Azure Blob Storage, and for your back end, if you wanted to add any other functionality to your Azure function, you'd have to edit it and deploy it to Azure each time. What if you could do something like every time you commit your code, either from the front end or the back end directory, it'll get automatically pushed and deployed to the correct service? Well, we actually can do that, and we are going to do that with some CI/CD. Let's dive into this section. Alrighty, welcome to section 4, building our CI/CD pipeline. We're going to be covering a few things here. First, we're going to create our front-end workflow, and that's what's going to be responsible for deploying any changes that we make to our HTML, CSS, JavaScript, anything that's in that front-end folder. Our front-end GitHub workflow is going to take care of that. Then we're going to implement unit testing. So we're going to create unit tests to test our Azure Functions code, and we're going to include that in our CI/CD pipeline. And last but not least, we're going to create our backend workflow, which is creating the backend GitHub workflow responsible for deploying anything that's in the backend folder of our project. So that include our API, which includes our Azure Functions, or any changes to our tests. Okay. Before we do dive into any hands-on labs, I want to just briefly touch on what CI/CD is. All right, so CI/CD stands for continuous integration and continuous delivery. There are sort of 4 major areas here. So version control, which in our case, we're using Git and GitHub to track and manage changes to our code. Then there's continuous integration. So once our code is in version control, it'll go through a series of tests to validate the code. Then I'll move on to continuous delivery. Once it's passed those tests, it's placed in an area that it's ready to be pushed to production. Usually people will have to manually go in and push the button that'll say, yes, push this change to production. An optional step is the continuous deployment step, which once it reaches continuous delivery, it can automatically be pushed to production without anyone having to intervene and actually push a button there. Not everyone implements that, but it very much does happen in real production environments. So that's a very brief overlook of how CI/CD looks. Now let's go ahead and implement our own pipeline. All right, we're back in Visual Studio Code, and first we're going to add all of our changes because we haven't done that in a little bit. Commit, deployed, storage, and function. Git push. Fantastic. All right, so now we need to create the .github folder because our workflows are going to be in there as well. So let's go ahead and do, okay, so first we're going to make a hidden directory called GitHub, and in there, we're going to just move into that directory. We're actually going to make a folder called workflows. And inside of this folder, we're actually going to create 2 files. We're going to create one that's called front and .main.yaml. And then we're also going to create a backend.main.yaml. Fantastic. So if we expand that, we'll see our frontend.main and our backend. Whoops, we didn't create them in the right one. Hold on, we could just move these inside of that folder. Yes, they need to be inside of the workflows. Alrighty, so first thing you're going to need to do is generate a secret that we can save in our GitHub repository. We're going to use the Azure command line for that, so make sure you have that installed. First thing I'm going to do is do AZ account show just to make sure I'm working in the correct subscription, and yes, I am. All right, next I'm going to run this command, azadsp create for errorback --name. This will be the name. Azure Resume ACG. This is a new name. That's something that exists. --role contributor --scopes /subscription /your subscription ID. This is mine. Do not copy this one because this will not work for you. /resource groups / the name of your resource group. So for me, it's Azure Resume - resource group, and then -- SDK - auth. Let's run this. This should provide some JSON for us. And we'll need to copy all of this in here. So then we'll go ahead to settings and we'll scroll down to secrets, and we're going to create a new repository secret. And we can name this something like, probably just like Azure _credentials. Yes, and then we'll just paste in all that JSON that we got. Fantastic. So now we can return to our Visual Studio Code. Alrighty, so for a little cheat code here, we're going to reuse some code that Microsoft actually supplies us in some documentation. The link to this will be in the resources page. It's set up a GitHub Actions workflow to deploy your static website in Azure Storage. We're going to scroll down. We already created a service principal for this, and we've added it to the GitHub secret. So now what we're going to do is copy the full-on code here. Yeah, copy the bottom, the completed workflow, and we're going to go into Visual Codes over here and paste that into our front end. We'll close this terminal here to get some more space. Now, we do need to make some changes. We'll close this over here as well. Whoops, this one. And we're going to change the name first of all. We're going to name it deploy _ frontend, and we'll add a comment in here. Deploys when push is made from the front-end folder. Fantastic. So this on section is just going to tell the workflow, all right, when do we want to make this workflow run? And the push will be from main, because that's the name of the branch. And we're not going to do any pull requests. And inside of this branch, we also have to provide paths because we don't want it to be from anywhere. We want it to listen to a specific path. And in here, we'll add front end because that's the name of the folder. So whenever there's a change anywhere from inside the front end folder. Okay, let's go down more here. Jobs, the build, the run on is fine. Everything's pretty fine here. This authenticates and logs into Azure for us. Let's move into this upload to Blob Storage part. Use a CLI, that's great. And in here, we do have to make a change. So the Azure AZ Storage Blob upload - batch account name. Here you need to provide the name of your storage account. Mine is Azure Resume ACG. And you can always just go into your Azure portal to verify to make sure you're providing the correct name. And we also, this blob container is fine. -s, but instead of the dot here, we need to provide it the front end directory. Okay. Now, remember I told you about purging and caching? We have a step in here that's going to do that for us. And look, we didn't even have to add any code. The template provides that for us. But we do need to provide the actual profile names that we have. Contents path, everything profile name, and then our profile name is here. And then our endpoint name, I made them both the same. And the resource group is Azure Resume - resource group. Fantastic. And then we can leave the rest as is. So the rest is only just logging out for us. Let's bring up the terminal and then just go back here. Make sure it's saved here. We'll go back to yes, we're at the beginning of the, we'll just do a git add. We're at the top of our repo. Git everything, git commit -m update, created workflows. How about that? Workflows. Workflows. Here we go. Git push. Fantastic. We go in workflows. We see we have our front end. It's in here. So now what we have to do is make a commit from within the front end. So we got a failure in here of, oh, yes. So we go back into actions and we can see when certain workflows get executed. And this looks like the backend failed, but that's because we haven't implemented the backend yet. So we'll go into here and we'll move into the front end. And let's make some kind of change in the HTML here, for example. We'll say, hi, I'm Gwyneth. And we'll make a change in here. GitHub, git add everything, git commit updates to HTML, and then we'll do git push. And we'll go back to our actions, and that should have triggered our deploy frontend. All right, so right now it looks like updates to HTML. That's the commit that we just did. Let's click on this here, and it looks like it's starting our workflow. Alrighty, so we see the action has completed successfully. Let's head over to the website and see if it actually updated correctly. So remember, we made that change. Hello, I'm Gwyneth, and it worked. Now, let's make sure everything else is in here. Fantastic. Oh, and the counter works too. So if we refresh this. Awesome, so our front end is now working. We've created our action. Let's take a look at our backend. But before we take a look at our backend, we have to talk about testing. Alrighty, let's touch on why unit tests matter. I mean, there are a bunch of reasons, but I think the four main ones are you save hours of debugging because you won't be able to finish a task on your list until you write code that passes the test, right? The whole point of unit tests is to test the code before you can move on. Then you write more efficient code because it helps you keep your code simple. You write just enough code until your tests actually pass, and then you can move on, right? It improves documentation because a test itself is a small piece of code that will describe something, a story or a requirement or a factor or something like that, right? And it helps us reduce errors during deployment. It'll help us catch any last minute issues. Just make sure our code is passing, validations and tests. Of course, our tests need to actually be testing for the correct things in order for these errors to be reduced. But I think these are the four main reasons why tests matter and why we're going to implement them in our pipeline and for our code in this project. So we're going to move into our backend. So we'll go into our backend, and then in here we're going to move into our tests folder, right? There's nothing in here except a README. So in here, what you're going to do is type in .NET new xunit. We'll go in here, tests, and we'll see a test unit project was created for us. Alrighty, we do need to add a package. Do .NET add package Microsoft.ASP net core.mvc. Okay, and next we need to add a reference to our functions app. So we can do this by typing it .NET add reference. And since the app lives a folder above us, we'll just say it's in API. And then in here we have api.csproj. api.csproj. So that's what we're going to reference here. Great. So now if we go into our test.csproj, we'll see the packages that we needed were added there. And also this reference was added for us as well. Finally, in order to just test the files that were created for us, we can do a simple .NET test. And you see this file unittest1.cs was created. The way to execute that test is with that .NET test command. And we see a total of 1 test files matched, and it passed. If we go into here, it's doing, doesn't really do anything. So it's going to pass there. Okay, so now we can add the files that I provided in our starter code. So I'm in the Finder here, and from the starter code, I'm going to grab all of these files. I'm going to copy and then go into the backend, go into tests, and then in here, I'm going to paste these in here. Fantastic. We'll head back into Visual Studio Code. We're going to actually close everything in here and throw away that terminal. We don't need any of these. And we have a bunch of files in here too. Okay, tests. So a bunch of these are helper files. I'm not going to go too deep into these because it's outside of the scope of the video, but there is a link in the resource that's official Microsoft documentation about testing Azure Functions. Right now, we're going to focus just on this test counter. We're going to actually remove this unit test because we don't need this anymore. Test counter. What matters here is this test file, test counter.cs, and we'll see that the actual body is this fact. So in order for this test to pass, we need this fact to be true. What's going on here is we're creating an object of type counter, and that's the same as this counter here, this class that we used. All right, let's go back into here, and we're providing it the ID, which is actually going to be 1. And then we're just giving it a random count number 2. And then we're going to create an HTTP request. And then we're going to run the function. And we're going to provide the counter and then an out counter. So if we're providing 2 as the count, and then we execute the function, it should return 3 because it increments by 1. So we'll go ahead into our backend. We'll move into tests. And then in here, we'll just do .NET test. Let's see what happens. Alrighty. And we here said passed, failed none, passed 1. So it looked like it did pass. Now, what if I said 4 in here? I changed this to 4. And we'll save that. And then we'll run this. This should fail. It's also good to test your code to make sure it fails when it's supposed to fail. And we'll see here, failed 1, passed 1, passed 0, sorry. Switch that back to 3. Fantastic. So now what we can do is implement this into our backend workflow. Once again, we have a lovely Microsoft documentation that we're going to use as a template. And again, this is in the resource documents. And then this is continuous delivery by using GitHub Actions, and this is specific to Azure Functions. If we scroll down, we'll have the complete workflow here. We're going to copy that, and we're going to go back into our project, and we're going to close all these because it's getting pretty big. We'll go to our backend here, and we'll close this off here, and then we'll paste in we have to edit some things. That's what the template is for, right? So first thing is we're going to change this name to just deploy backend. And in here, in our on, we're going to make sure it's on the right branch. So in here, we're going to say on push and make sure it's set to the correct branch main. And then paths again, like we did in the front end, we're going to make sure this is set to backend. Backend. So whenever there's a change anywhere in the backend, this one will execute. Fantastic. So for our environment, we're going to replace this with our Azure function name. In our case, it's get resume counter. And the package, the Azure Function app package path is going to be backend because it lives inside of that folder. And the .NET version is actually going to be 3.1. All right. So we can keep these pretty much as is because these work exactly. And now we're going to run. This looks good for us. Except here we're going to have to add API because remember our function lives in the API folder inside of the backend. So remember we're telling it to run from backend. So we'll have to make sure it goes into the right folder, right? /API configuration. Yep, that looks good to me. Now we need to add one more job though. And we're going to call this run unit test. Fantastic. And we need to make sure we tell it to use the power shell, and then we'll run. In here, we can actually copy this in here. It's pretty similar. Paste that in here. Oh, we didn't copy the pipe over. Hold on. We need a new line here. There we go. And make sure that lines up here. Run push C from a. Now we need to change this folder because this is for the tests. It's going to run from tests. And all we're going to run in here is .NET test. We're going to tell it to run that command. And then finally, everything else should be, we need to add here API/output. And I don't believe we'll need this publish profile. I think we just need app name package. One thing I did just notice that we forgot. Let's head into our front end and we're going to copy this. We have to log in to our Azure account actually. Here we go. Okay, so we'll paste that into our backend right after it says runs on Windows latest step check out. Oh, here we go. So right after this one, we'll paste that in. We'll name this first though. Say name. Login via Azure CLI. And then we'll make sure these are aligned here. Name uses with creds. What's going on here? Oh, creds, Azure. Yeah, and this is going to use the same secret that we generated for our front end. So we don't have to generate anything new there. All right, now we'll have to do one more. Git add, git commit, and then we'll push this here. And let's go to our workflows here and just make sure it actually worked. Alrighty, that looks good to me. Go into CD backend. So we'll move into the backend. And then from here, we'll just do, hold on, we'll close these here. Go into our backend. And we'll go into our resume here. And in here, we'll add a small comment. Here is where the counter gets updated. Whoop, there we go. Okay, so now we'll do a git add everything, git commit, and we'll say updates to function, and then we'll push this here. And this should execute our backend. So we'll our backend workflow here. And we'll go to deploy backend. Updates to function. Let's see what's going on. All right, so we did get an error in our unit tests, and it looks like the reference assemblies for .NET Framework v5 were not found. All right, this is good. This allows us to do some debugging. Let's go into our Visual Studio Code, and that makes me suspect that something in the CS project file is just not correct. So target framework should be this. If we go into the tests one, if we go into test here, we'll see that it's not the right one. So let's replace that. I think that'll fix the issue for us. Let's go ahead and do another commit. Updated test CS Proj. All right, that should execute our backend YAML once more. And we'll go back into here, and we'll go in here, and we'll just continue debugging any other errors that we get. Alrighty, and now we have a successful backend deploy. And we'll scroll down here and we'll see .NET test and total tests 1, passed 1. Fantastic. And wow, we're done. We got hands-on with a bunch of different technologies: Azure, Azure Functions, Azure CosmosDB, GitHub, GitHub Actions, .NET, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and a bunch more. We understand the importance of CI/CD, testing our code, and of course, we have a brand new project on our GitHub, a shiny new digital resume, and an experience that we can now talk about. Alrighty, and that is it for this episode of ACG Projects. I hope you had a great time and you learned something. If you have any questions at all, make sure to hop into the Discord, which I will leave a link in the resources, and ask away. If you liked this project, make sure to leave us a thumbs up, subscribe for more projects. Keep being awesome, Cloud Gurus. I'll see you in the next one.